We're in Siman Reish Pei Vav. We're at Sif Yud Gimel. Now, I will preface, as I have been doing often, and it will continue, by saying that this Sif has probably hundreds of pages discussion written on it, and it's perhaps one of the most discussed Seifim in all of Hilchos Mezuzah, and a number of shiurim would be required to cover it, so we'll try and do it in 2 or 3 minutes. Sif Yud Gimel, Bayis she'ein by arba ames ala arba ames potter. A bayis. Now, the Aruch Shulchan points out in the beginning of Hilchos Mezuzah that when the Shulchan Aruch says bayis, doesn't mean bayis, it means a room. So a room that is not the size of 4 ames by 4 ames is potter from a mezuzah. Ve'im yesh by kidei l'rabeya arba ames al arba ames b'shaveh af al pi she'arka yoser al rach by oishahu ogul or bal chamisha zav yischayev. So we just said that a room needs to be 4 by 4 ames in order to be chayev. So what if the room would be 8 by 2 ames, which is the equivalent square footage? So the Mechaber says that would be chayev as well. Now, there's a tremendous amount to talk about here. As I say, we'll try and make it very brief. So this is the simple halach in Shulchan Aruch. So where this is negeya, most often is by walk-in closets or a pantry or storage rooms in the home or things of that nature, which are less than dalet al dalet. So the simple reading in the Mechaber is that it's potter. Again, we're talking about when it's less than dalet al dalet entirely. Now, this is actually, surprisingly, the source of a huge machlokes. If you look in the Pischei Tshuva over here, you will see that the Pischei Tshuva says in Sifkat Yud Aleph, Arba Amis, Kasa b'Sefer Chemud Daniel Ksav Yad, Nira Dafka Beis Dira Tzarech Dafka Shehe Arba Amis al Arba Amis, Abel Beis Shar Umir Peset V'Gina Afilu Lesbu Arba Chayavin. Ba'oid Nira b'mi sheyesh lo bayis gadol v'yesh lo chadarim ketanim laniach sham chafetzim d'chayavim b'mezuzah. So Chemud Daniel here is saying 2 things. He's saying, number one, that when the Mechaber says bayis, I mentioned the Aruch HaShulchan, who says it doesn't mean a bayis, it means a room. That's the opinion of most Paiskim, but the Pischei Tshuva here is quoting the Chemud Daniel, who's saying that no, that a house that's less than dalet al dalet is potter because a house is not fit to live in. You can't live in a home that's less than dalet al dalet. But a room within a home is perfectly functional when it's less than dalet al dalet. On the contrary, there are many rooms that are built specifically by the architect to be less than dalet al dalet because that's the way it works best. So the Chemud Daniel says, so such a room would be chayev. In other words, the only heter not to put up a mezuzah is a home that's less than dalet al dalet. But a room within a home that's less than dalet al dalet is chayev. Furthermore, the Chemud Daniel says that only a home that's less than dalet al dalet is potter, but a beishar, in other words, an entranceway to a home, would be chayev even if it's less than dalet al dalet. So, for instance, the hallway of a building, if it's less than dalet al dalet, would be chayev. A hallway of a home, if it's less than dalet al dalet, would be chayev. Now, the hallway generally is dalet al dalet kedei l'rabeya. You have the square footage of dalet al dalet, and the Mechaber just said that it's chayev. Sounds like that would be even with a bracha. But if you look in the Gra, you'll see that the Gra says that that's the opinion of the Rambam. Aval harosh chaylik al zeh. So the Gra seems to be paskening like the Rosh that dalet al dalet kedei l'rabeya is potter, and the Chazon Ish paskins like the Rosh that dalet al dalet kedei l'rabeya is potter. So this is also a tremendous. So both of these things are a tremendous machlokes. Number one, a bias that's pachas midalet al dalet, the Mechaber says is potter. The Chemud Daniel says it's chayev. Now there's actually a cheder, and there's a third opinion. How could there be a third opinion? Either it's chayev or it's potter. The answer is it could be a third opinion. The Chazon Ish has a third opinion. What's that? He says that a walk-in closet is potter, like the Mechaber, not like the Chemud Daniel. So you go into a walk-in closet, it's less than dalet al dalet, it's potter, right? But where's the walk-in closet? It's in your master bedroom. So now you go into the walk-in closet and you get dressed. Now you're exiting your walk-in closet. So you're exiting, you're traversing a doorway into a room that's bigger than dalet al dalet, namely your bedroom, right? Or if you have a kitchen that's a large American kitchen, larger than Dalet al Dalet, and you have a pantry that's less than Dalet al Dalet. So you've gone into your pantry. According to the Mechaber, you were potter. According to the Chumud Daniel, you were chayiv. Okay, so the Chazon Ish agrees with the Mechaber. You were potter. But says the Chazon Ish, argues the Chazon Ish, you're now exiting your pantry into your kitchen. So you need a mezuzah, according to the Chazon Ish, in all these cases, on the right side, as you exit the room that's pachas midalad al dalad. By definition, doesn't the Mechaber disagree with the Chazon Ish? Yes. Yes, it would seem that the Mechaber, by definition, does disagree with the Chazon Ish. That's a very astute observation. And Rav Moshe Feinstein as well is doiche the shita of the Chazon Ish b'shtei yadayim. Rav Moshe firmly disagrees with the Chazon Ish because Rav Moshe says that the chiyuv mezuzah is derech bi'osai, derech bi'oscha, right? That's a Gemara. The Gemara says that the chiyuv mezuzah is on your way in, right? So Rav Moshe says, so if you on your way into the pantry were potter, so on your way out you're not going to be chayiv. And I was this magic trick that the Chazon Ish wants to say that when you're exiting the pantry into your kitchen, that's called a knisa. Rav Moshe says that's not called a knisa, that's called a yetzia, because how do you get into the pantry in the first place? So Rav Moshe very strongly disagrees with the Chazon Ish, and this is negea by a porch as well, by a backyard or a porch, right? So over there also the Chazon Ish holds that a backyard or a porch is potter, because it's not part of the home. Rav Moshe holds that a backyard or a porch is chayiv, because it is part of the home. Like the Beis Yosef and the Maril seem to hold, and the Taz seem to hold like Rav Moshe as well. Even though they have no roof, because of the rush that we saw yesterday. But the Chazon Ish argues, and the Chazon Ish says that no, that he holds like the Beis Meir, that a backyard or a porch is not part of your home. So again, this machlokes comes into play. According to the Chazon Ish, since your porch and your backyard are potter from a mezuzah, so you're going to need a mezuzah on the right side coming in from the backyard or the porch. And Rav Moshe says, no, that's derech yetzia, that's not derech knisa, because how do you get into the backyard or the porch in the first place? So Rav Moshe disagrees with the Chazon Ish, betarti. Number one, he disagrees with the Chazon Ish that you're chayev on the return. And number two, Rav Moshe more fundamentally, or number one really, disagrees and holds that the porch and the backyard are actually chayiv, because it's no different than another room in your house. The one exception would be if your backyard, as very often, at least in America, is the case, that your backyard you can enter from the Rishus Harabim. You can park your car in the driveway, and then you can enter your backyard and you can enter your house. So in that case, Rav Moshe would agree that it's a knisa. But when the backyard is sealed, or if you live on the third floor and you have a porch, so Rav Moshe holds that is chayiv, and you need a mezuzah on the right side going out to the backyard or to the porch. Chazon Ish bases himself on Rabbi Akiva Eiger. However, Rav Moshe says that that's not the pshat in Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Furthermore, the Rabbi Chaim Sonnenfeld says that's not the pshat in Rabbi Akiva Eiger. And even, this is very, very rare, of Nissim Kirelitz and Chutshani, he also argues on the Chazon Ish and says that that's not the simple understanding of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. However, with that said, Rabbi Yashiv, Rav Vosner, and many others do understand the Rabbi Akiva Eiger like the Chazon Ish. So that's why I attributed the Shita to the Chazon Ish and not Rabbi Akiva Eiger, because there's a dispute as to whether or not that's actually what Rabbi Akiva Eiger says. Rabbi Akiva Eiger is here on the page, but we're not going to go into it now because we've already spent a lot of time on this.
The walk-in closet is actually Dalet Amos square?
No, so I've been talking until now where the pantry or the walk-in closet is less than Dalet Amos, period. But if your walk-in pantry or your closet is Dalet al Dalet Kedei L'Rabeya, meaning it's 8 by 2 Amos, for instance, so then you'd have another layer of machlokes, because there, according to the Mechaber, it's actually chayev. So the Sfardim, I think, perhaps would even make a bracha on a cheder that's Dalet al Dalet Kedei L'Rabeya, because the Mechaber says it's chayev. He doesn't bring any opposing deya going in. However, the Shach in Chav Gimel says that V'das hara she'ein chayev b'mezuzah elam keinu meruba arba al arba amis. So you have a machlokes. The Mechaber is passing like the Rambam, and he's not even bringing the rush. Ulafisha kasav beis Yosef denaktinan ka Rambam tehalei pligi aleha ela harash. Very funny lashon in the beis Yosef. We paskin like the Rambam because nobody argues on him except for the rush. Okay. Leihevi kan ela divrei Rambam and Mela the Mechaber over here ignored the rush, but the Gra, as we said, not only mentioned the rush, but even paskin like the rush. Yeah, that's why it's it's a little odd.
There's no roof at all.
Yeah, there's no roof at all. Aval be'emes gam das Rabbeinu. Yeah, but here again, the Shach says another funny thing over here. Aval be'emes gam das Rabbeinu Yerucham b'soif sefer Adam ka'arash. So what's the Beis Yosef talking about? That it's only the Rosh who argues on the Rambam. Rabbeinu Yerucham also argues on the Rosh. Now, why is that funny? Rabbeinu Yerucham is a Talmud of the Rosh. So, okay, because of Shekain Tafsu Iker, Al Kain Yer, the Yesh L'Kava B'lei Brachas. So the Shach makes a pshara, and he says to be noyeg like the Mechaber, but don't make a bracha. So Ashkenazim generally, one would think, would be noyeg that a cheder that's dalet al dalet kedei l'rabeya, you would put up a mezuzah on the right side going in, just without a bracha like the Shach. However, again, Chazon Ish comes along and turns everything on its head, and he says, no, we pass him like the Rush. We don't pass him, he argues on the Shulchan Aruch. And he says the halacha is like the Rush, which again is the pashtus of the Gra. Now there's a Taz, which again, this you could spend an entire 1 hour shir on the Taz. The Taz is, if I remember correctly, in Tafresh Lamed Dalet, I think, in Hilchas Sukkah, where the Taz says that there is no machlekes, the Rosh and the Rambam, and the Rambam actually agrees to the Rosh. The Gra and the Mechaber are paskening like the Rambam. It says the Taz, they both made a mistake. Yeah, I mean the Gra came after him, but he says that's not the Pshat in the Rambam, and they misunderstood the Rambam. Chazon Ish agrees with the Taz, and this is a massive machlekes achreinim. And anybody who has the shaila should ask the local Orthodox rabbi, and that's enough for now.
So in a small kitchen, part of that.
Very good. So that's another question, which is also shockingly a machlekes hapaiskim. Question being asked is, let's say you have a kitchen that is 5 by 5 amas, right? But when you factor in the cabinetry, so it takes up floor space, and now you have less than Dalet al Dalet amas. So do you assume that this room do you measure from wall to wall, or do you measure floor space, and those walking space? So one thing is for sure is that the refrigerator and an oven and things like that, if it's a plug-in oven, no, it's not a built-in oven, things that are movable, all places can agree that is not memayit from the area. However, the cabinetry, that is a machlekes, and some say that it is memayit because you only take into account the space that you can actually move around in, and others say that doesn't make any sense. The cabinetry is part of the kitchen. I'm keeping my frying pan in there, and I'm keeping my stuff in there, and I'm putting my hands in there, and I'm putting things and taking things out. So it's part of the room. So that's a machlekes hapaiskim as well. Yudalid, bayis she'ein lo tikra potter, a house or a room that does not have a roof is potter. So I'll just mention again, this is also, all these things are very big sugyas, but where this comes up is in people's houses. You have it, it's very common here in Eretz Yisrael, and you see it advertised in the Jewish media a lot, that they'll build you an extension that the ceiling comes off for sukkahs, right? And then you push a button and the ceiling comes back down, right? Or you have a pulley system, whatever it is, right? So you're getting into a shaila after sukkah. Well, first of all, on sukkahs, you have to take off your mezuzah because the room now doesn't have a roof. We just said bayish ein leitikra is potter. Or more importantly, after sukkahs, if you left your mezuzah on and you put your roof back on, is it now tasav l'ay min asli? So this is a huge sugya and a huge machlekes. But be that as it may, a house that doesn't have a roof is potter. Now we mentioned, I'll again point out, that in the previous sif, we mentioned that the Chemud Daniel holds that a room that's less than Dalet al Dalet, if it's functional, is chayiv, not like the Mechaber. Why? One of the proofs that he brings is from what we discussed a day or two ago, and that is that you asked Reb Gershon, why is a backyard chayiv, according to Rav Moshe at least, or a front yard as a Beis Shar is chayiv according to everybody. Why is that? It doesn't have a roof. So we answered because the Rosh says that since it's fully functional without a roof, and I'd even prefer it without a roof, so it's chayiv. So that's one of the proofs that the Chemud Daniel brings to a room that's pachas midalet al dalet. He says the same way that you're mechayev a chotzer, right? Because it's functional and even preferable without a roof. So if my pantry is functional and even preferable if it's less than dalet al dalet, so I'm also missing a condition that ostensibly is required in order to put up a mezuzah. So that would also, that's one of his proofs that he brings. There are those that argue on that proof, but I'm just pointing it out. Anyway, Baya she'ein le tikra potter. A house that is a room, a house that doesn't have a roof is potter because a house without a roof is nishkein house. Haya miktsasei mekura, miktsasei eina mekura. Now, what if you have, this is very common, especially here in Eretz Yisrael, you live in the third floor, right? And let's say you hold like Moshe Feinstein or like the Chazon Ish, let's say you hold like the Chazon Ish that a porch is potter, right? And merpeset is potter. So you're on the third floor apartment and you walk out to your merpeset, you're potter according to the Chazon Ish. But you have the merpeset of the guy on top of you, right? Which is covering, so when so let's say it's raining and you walk out onto your merpeset, you're not going to get wet. Why? Because the guy on top of you, his merpeset is covering you. It's only when you walk further out to your merpeset, then you're going to get wet. In other words, your merpeset is, let's say, 25 square feet, and only when you walk further out is it open to the sky. In other words, that's where you put your sukkah. But the first little bit of your merpeset is covered by the guy on top of you. So that's this case. Haya miktsasei mekura or miktsasei eina mekura. What if you have a room that's partially covered and partially uncovered? Or if your ceiling for your sukkah comes in panels, so you only removed, let's say, the last panel, right? So half your room is covered, half your room is uncovered. So im haya hakirei keneged pesach, if the covered part is by the door, in other words, when I walk out to my merpeset, I have that ceiling. So then chayev b'mezuzah v'hu sheyeh b'makur b'dalet al dalet, right? If it's an area that's dalet al dalet, that's covered, so then I'm going to be chayev. In other words, because I'm traversing this doorway, I'm in an area that has a covering of dalet al dalet, so then it's going to be chayev. But if the covering, the guy on top of me, his porch is on the far end of the porch, so when I walk out to the porch, I'm exposed to the sky, so then the doorway to the porch is going to be potter. Now again, this is all, I'm just giving an example of a porch because it's the most common case, but it actually, like I'm saying, is referring to a room. If you would have a hechatimsi in somebody's house of a room that has a half a ceiling, so this halacha would apply. I'll just also point out that Rabbi Yashiv and Rabbi Nissim Kirelitz, the example that I gave specifically, they don't agree with. In other words, they hold that a porch is a porch, and the fact that the guy on top of you, his porch, even covers dalet al dalet, keneged your door to your porch, they hold it's still potter from mezuzah, because they hold that's not called a ceiling. They hold that that's an incidental thing. It doesn't change. The idea of the ceiling is that it makes it into a real room, i.e., it's meshana the shimush, your shimush of the room. But Rabbi Yashiv and Rabbi Nissim say that your porch, the function of the porch doesn't change a ki huzeh if the guy's merpeset is on top of you, neged your door, or at the far end of the porch. And therefore they say that they hold like the Chazon Ish, that no matter what, the porch will be potter. There are those that argue with them. Even if it covers the whole thing, it would still be potter. Rabbi Nissim says, I'm not the bar plukta of Rabbi Nissim Kirelitz, I'm just reporting the news. If you want to know if I understand what I'm about to tell you, no, I don't. But Rabbi Nissim Kirelitz says that even if you closed in your porch, it's with a ceiling and windows all around, you pay 10,000 shekels to close in your porch because you don't want it open, it's still potter from mezuzah, and you would need it on the reverse side going back in, again with the same argument, because they taina that it's not meshana your shimush of the porch. Rabbi Yashiv holds that way also. It's beyond my little brain to understand, but that's what they both hold. Obviously, there are many places that don't agree with that, but that's their opinion. Tezvav, habayis, afalpi. Tezvav is also a whole sugya. Moshe has Just agav, I'll just point out, there's a tremendous amount, and this is not apropos to anything, but there's a tremendous amount of machlokes in Hilchos Mezuzah, specifically between Rav Moshe Feinstein and the Chazon Ish. So like almost as we're moving through the Seifim, if you want to go through Igros Moshe and you want to go through the Sefer Chazon Ish, you will find that they butt heads very, very, very often. The last two Seifim that we read, they have a disagreement about, I think, and this one that we're about to read also is a subject of very fascinating tshuva of Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe says as follows. Rav Moshe, the Mechaber says as follows. Habayis, afal pisha ein loy telasis, chayev b'mezuzah, v'yesh mi shepoiter. If you have a house or a room, right, that doesn't have a door, so the Mechaber says it's chayev in mezuzah, right? But he brings a yesh mi shepoiter, and that's the famous Shitas Harambam, that if there's no door, it's potter. So therefore, this is extremely relevant in all homes and apartments. It's because very often you have a dining room, a living room, a salon over here, whatever it may be, and there's no door, right? You have a doorway, or off the salon, you have a hallway going to the bedrooms, right? And there's a Pesach going from the salon into the hallway. Right, and as I say, in America, on the main floor of most homes, you have the living room, dining room, and kitchen, and usually there's no doors there, right? But you do have doorways. So according to this Yesh Mi Shepaiter that the Mechaber is bringing, which is the sheet of the Rambam, so those places don't need a mezuzah. Now, obviously, we put a mezuzah in all those places, but we just don't make a bracha. What? Sfardim do as well, yeah, because the Mechaber brings over here a stam v'yesh misha poiter. So the stam is that it's chayev. So the Sfardim certainly also put up a mezuzah, but without a brach. So everybody, I think the minhag by almost the entire world, Ashkenazim, Sfardim, Chassidim, everybody, is that a room that does not have a door, we will put up a mezuzah without a bracha. Now, again, I'll just mention it because it's very interesting. Rav Moshe Feinstein has a fascinating tshuva where he discusses a case. So sometimes, again, this is very relevant, especially in America, on the main floor of a home. Like I said, you often have the living room, dining room, and the kitchen, and you can get from one room to the other in two different ways. In other words, you can enter the living room, and then there's or the dining room. You can enter the dining room, and then there's a door into the kitchen. Or you can enter the kitchen, and there's a door into the dining room. Now, as you walk into the house, and you're in the main lobby or hallway, and immediately on your right is a dining room, for instance. If you walk further in the hallway, on your right is a kitchen, and then there's a doorway between the dining room and the kitchen, right? So I can walk into the house, walk into the dining room, walk into the kitchen, or I can walk into the house, walk into the kitchen, walk into the dining room. So which way is the derech knisa, which way is the derech yitzia? But the doorway between the dining room and the kitchen, where do I need a mezuzah? So there's rules. The rules are that there's a machlekes Reb Elyashiv and Rav Moshe, what the rules are, or what the seder of the rules are. But just mentioning the rules, one rule is Heker tzir. Heker tzir means the direction that the door opens into. Okay? So when you're going you walk into your house, you're in a hallway, you're going into a bedroom, doesn't make a difference which way the door swings. And as a mamad door often swings out. That doesn't mean you should put a mezuzah on the other side, because over there's a clear derech knisa. I'm going from the hallway into the bedroom, I'm always going to need a mezuzah on my right side. But when it's not clear which way is the derech knisa, like our case with the kitchen and the dining room, so then one of the rules is you'll follow a heker tzir, right? But that's the last rule. What's the first rule? First rule is machlokes Rav Moshe and Reb Elyashiv. Rav Moshe holds the first rule is roiv. Roiv at the time, are you going from the dining room to the kitchen? Or roiv at the time, are you going from the kitchen to the dining room? So Rav Moshe says it's totally in roiv. Reb Elyashiv says not totally in roiv, it's totally in choshev. Which room is more choshev? Right? So Reb Elyashiv says, if Dave Landau was coming to your house, you'd sit with him in the kitchen? No, you'd sit with him in the dining room. So the dining room is more choshev than the kitchen, and therefore the mezuzah would have to be on the right side, going from the kitchen to the dining room. Now Rav Moshe happens to disagree with that also, and Rav Moshe says, what are you talking about? How much time do you spend in the dining room every week, right? 4 hours a week, max? How much time do you spend in the kitchen a week, right? 35 hours? So Rav Moshe says, so the kitchen is more chashuv. So that is also a machlekes Reb Moshe and Reb Elyashiv. So that's, so now what do you do if there's no roiv and there's no chashuv, right? Now, I know people that have 2 living rooms, right? Have 2 living rooms. So the 2 rooms are of equal chashivas and there's no roiv. It's used equally. And there's no heker tzir because you don't have a door. So where do you put the mezuzah? So Rav Moshe has a tshuva, he says, pater from mezuzah. Amazing chiddush from Rav Moshe, he says pater from mezuzah. Everybody argues on Rav Moshe, and they hold like Rav Shlomo Kluger that you can put the mezuzah on either side. Whichever side you want, you can put the mezuzah. But Rav Moshe says in such a case that it's pater. Tezayin, harbe chadorim zelifnim mizeh kulam chayavim b'mezuzah. Let's say you have a home that you walk into the home and you walk into a room, so it needs a mezuzah. Now from that room, you walk into another room, so you need another mezuzah. From that room, you walk into another room, you need another mezuzah. No matter how many rooms you're entering, you're always going to need a mezuzah on what's called the pnimi, right? That's a general rule in Hilchas Mezuzah, which I've alluded to a whole bunch of times. I've used the word knisa until now, but another word for knisa is pnimi. The rule in Hilchas Mezuzah is you always need a mezuzah going from the chitzain to the pnimi. The only time that you have all the shilas that we were talking about a moment ago is when it's not clear what's the chitzain and what's the pnimi, right? In the case I gave before, with the dining room and the kitchen, either one could be the chitzain or the pnimi. So that's where the shilas start. But in a regular situation, regular apartment or a home, the pnimi, another word for pnimi would be flow of traffic. You just follow the flow of traffic. Now, where it gets confusing is in America, especially, where people have 2 or 3 doors to get into your house. You can walk into the front door of the house, or there's a side door by the driveway, or there's a back door by the backyard. So if potentially 3 different directions, sometimes even 4, right? The house I lived in when I was growing up, we had 4, like Avraham Avinu. We had a front door, we had a door on the side by the driveway, we had another door by the other neighbor's driveway, and we had a back door. Right? So then you have, so what's your knisa and what's your yitzia? That's when everything goes haywire and you come to that machlokes of Rav Moshe that he holds it goes basar roiv and Rav Elyashiv holds it goes basar chashuv. But under normal circumstances, the rule is you put a mezuzah on the right side as you go from the chitzain to the pnimi.